Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Kilayim chapter 3, Halacha 2. This is on the Art Scroll 28a2. Today we're going to be getting into what are going to be Zeraim, and also we're going to be getting more onto these border areas. We're playing with the borders. We left off in chapter 3, Halacha 1 with playing with these fences and other kinds of borders, and we saw that melons are going to be issues because they challenge our concepts of these borders to separate these planting areas. Now we're going to be getting into other kinds of issues with borders. The Mishnah starts off and it says that one may not plant any type of seeds classified as Zeraim in a garden patch, even that in the way that we were talking about in the last Mishnah, where we were talking about that you can plant in an unbordered 6x6 tefach patch 5 different varieties. Well, if one of the varieties is going to be classified as Zeraim, you're not allowed to do that. The Mishnah continues and says, but one may plant all types of seeds classified as Yerushalmi in a garden patch. And, what is going to be new about that, right? We already knew that regarding, you can have multiple, species in a small patch. And we know that that's going to be for vegetables. Why is that? Well, these are normally going to be planted in small patches, and it's not going to look mingled. And now it's adding in this new class of vegetable with Zeraim. These are normally going to be planted in fields. Now, if you're going to plant this together in a small patch, it's going to look mingled. And so what this is trying to show is that if you plant both Yerushalmi and Zeraim, which are going to be like this subset of a larger category of plants, then what's going to happen is you're going to end up with these small patches looking mixed. Part of the idea about the Zeraim is that some of these plants are going to have different biological characteristics that is going to sort of grow into the other stuff, and it's going to make it look mixed up. Now, the difference between Yerushalmi and Zeraim is going to be that also that Zeraim is going to get more nourishment from the ground than Yerushalmi, and that's going to be another problem. So Zeraim can't be packed into a small patch like what we were talking about, where you can put 5 in a 6 tefach box. You can't do that. And by the way, you can't use, even if it's bordered, you can't go up to 13 in this sort of configuration, because again, we cared both in the last Mishnah and this Mishnah about the nourishment area. And over here, the problem is going to be with the Zeraim, it's going to pull more nourishment from the ground, and the smaller Zeraim, even if it's going to go into a small patch, is going to be depriving the other plant. And, very much, we have this concept in the Torah that, okay, you're not allowed to plow with a donkey and ox because they have different energy levels, and you're not allowed to thresh with a donkey and ox tied together. They have different energy levels, and they're created differently. And this is sort of an idea like that, right? So that, you're going to be robbing or overworking one area. In case of the nutrition, you're going to be depriving, one plant of the nutrition on the other one. And so that's going to be counting here as your coat. Now, the Gemara is going to be implying about this that plants that are going to be grown for the leaves are going to be known as Yerushalmi. So that's going to be, like green, right, in Hebrew. That's going to be for the color of the leaves. And then you're going to have Zeraim, which is implying seeds, and that's going to be grown where you're trying to get the seeds, right? You buy a package of beans. You didn't buy the package of beans because you wanted the greens. While you can get greens for that, and they're going to be quite good, you wanted the beans. And so it's trying to divide up, saying, well, Yerushalmi generally is going to be where you're getting it for the greens, and something where you're getting it for the seeds is going to be like chickpeas or beans or peas or things like that. You didn't really necessarily grow it for the greens, and you really wanted it for the seeds. Now, we're going to get into this. What happens if you want, the leaves? Well, it's going to apply, to the intention. We're going to get into that later. Now, we're going to get more into this categorization of these plants. It says mustard and smooth beans are classified as Zeraim, and they can't be planted as one of these species in a patch like what we were just talking about in Halacha 1. Now, one of the things about this is going to be, well, mustard seeds. Why do you want the mustard? You want the mustard seeds. You want to make mustard with your mustard seeds. Now, yeah, mustard can be used as greens. Mustard greens are quite delicious, in fact. But in here, the intention is that you wanted the seeds for your mustard spread that you're going to be making. And also, why mustard? Why would mustard be a problem? Well, you generally grow that in big fields. You need a lot of area to grow a big patch to get enough of these seeds to make it worthwhile. And also, it's going to be drawing more nutrition. So basically, Mishnah says mustard and smooth beans are going to be classified as Zeraim. And it says, on the other hand, large beans are going to be classified as a type of Yerek. And thus, you could plant that in a species of a patch. Now, these large beans are going to be generally planted in small patches. And why is that going to be? The Rosh is going to be saying is that they don't draw as much nourishment because they're going to be picked earlier for the greens. And that's why they're going to be able to be picked. In other words, that you have these large beans, and if you were to leave them to develop, that would be one case. But what the Rosh is pointing out about this is that over here, these are going to be where they're going to actually harvest it for the greens. So can you put these large beans inside this 6x6 patch? Yes, because you're not taking it for the greens, for the seeds. You're taking it for the greens. And that really is just going to make it so that you have this one type of vegetable that can have two uses. And we saw that earlier with some kinds of plants. And over here, it's going to be where also this could have two types of uses. And over here, you want the greens. You don't care about the beans that would come about later. Now, we're going to get into this patch like what we were talking about that gets surrounded by a 1 tefach high border. In that case, it's going to be a walking path. And we've talked about that in the last Mishnah, that you can have 13, and in some cases, some explanation of the minority dissent is 18 species that can be planted, but the Tanakhama say 13, and that configuration on 13 is going to be 12 around the border and 1 in the middle for 6 in the actual middle patch. Now, the Mishnah is going to expand on this ruling, and it's going to say that a border that was initially 1 tefah high and it eroded, some of it, in other words, fell off. Maybe you were watering it, and now some of this walking path chipped away and fell away. And it says it was reduced to less than a tefach in height. It is still valid so that all the species can be left in place. For although, says this Mishnah, at this point is not the required height, it was valid from the start. So this Mishnah is teaching, says the Rosh, that although 1 tefach is the necessary separation for the height of the border, this is only required at the time of planting. And if some of this border gets reduced, the plants in the patch can be left. Now, the Chazan Ish adds about this that why does the Mishnah permit this, since at this point the required distance does not separate between species. The owner should be in violation of maintaining Kilayim. And the Chazan Ish answers his question and says from his book in Kilayim, he explains that this is because it is clear that there was once a raised border here, and in fact, most of it is still going to be visible there. And then you can walk by and you can see that, oh, well, Haval, maybe some water got onto it and eroded part of it, but I can still see the rest of the border, and there was a border there. Clearly, the intention was for separation. And by the way, the guy still, once he learns that this has been eroded, the farmer is allowed to come back and repair it, right? Maybe he just didn't get knowledge about this to go repair it, but the idea that the Chazan Ish says is that, it was clear that there was a border here, and visually you can still see part of the border there, and the different species, because of this, are not going to appear to be mingled, and because they don't appear to be mingled, they can be left in place. That's the explanation by the Chazan Ish about this. Now, the rest of the Mishnah is going to continue and say, concerning a furrow or a water channel that is 1 tefach deep, one may plant in either 3 varieties of seeds classified as Yerukot, so that you can have, it says, 1 on one side, 1 on the other side, and 1 in the middle. We covered this in the end of chapter 3 and part 3, chapter 3, Halacha 1, part 3 of the Shir, where it's saying, why can't you just plant 5 species? In other words, 1 on the north side of this hole, 1 on the south side, 1 on the east, and 1 on the west side, 1 in the middle. And the problem is it's going to be appearing to be mingled. The Tanakhama says it appears to be mingled. But if you're leaving off the north and south side, now it's going to look like, first of all, each of these three are going to be distinctive enough. Certainly the one in the middle is going to at least be 1 tefach by 1 tefach. It's going to count as being distinctive. But the other areas on the east and the west side that are not in the hole are going to not be seen to be where they're sort of mingled together. And the worry is that if you're putting 5 in this area, it's going to look to be mingled. That's going to be part of the problem. So the Gemara is going to start, and it's going to refer to this Mishnah saying that one may not plant any type of seed classified as Zeraim in a garden patch. And the Gemara is going to elaborate on this. And the Gemara says, concerning mustard and smooth beans that are classified as types of Zeraim that are now planted for the greens. In other words, you want your mustard greens. By the way, excellent for trying to pickle because you end up with something that you can store for a long time and quite delicious and useful in cooking. They use that a lot in Chinese cooking, by the way. So in this case, you have where they're not planted for the seeds, they're planted for the greens. And it says that one may nonetheless not put them into a garden patch together with the other species. That, by the way, is going to be a chiddush because you'd think, well, I didn't want this for the seed, I want it for the green, why can't I put this in? Panei Moshe is saying concerning the mustard and smooth beans that this Mishnah's classification is absolute. And even if the person's intent is to eat it for greens, they're nonetheless classified as Zeraim and they can't be put into a small patch. Now, what's going to be going on over here for these two particular species, even if you want to use it as a leaf, again, it's going to deal with nourishment. Nourishment's going to be the problem. Chazan Ish says about this in his Kilayim book in 8.2 and 8.3. It says that the Gemara is teaching that even when mustard and smooth beans are intended for the greens, they're going to draw too much nourishment, and they're going to still retain the classification of the Zeraim. And he continues that these plants retain the classification of Zeraim because the prevailing custom is to plant these for seeds. Even if you want them for greens, the intent is disregarded. So, in other words, what the Chazan Ish is hinting at is that there's a Maris Ein problem. Somebody's going to be walking by and seeing the mustard in there and saying, oh, normally this is grown for the seeds, and, well, this is just going to be a Kilayim patch, and, it's a Maris Ein issue. So that's one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is going to be that, well, maybe this just draws too much nourishment from the shared ground, regardless of whether you want the greens or not. That's another way that it could be. And the Gemara continues and says, on the other hand, concerning large beans and the Egyptian bean, we covered that before, that's going to be fool. And that's an ancient seed that has been used since the start of time as a food crop. And certainly in the ancient archaeology here in Israel, they find the Egyptian bean all over the place. It was something that was a staple of the food here. So it says it's dependent on what it was intended for. Gemara continues and says, in a case in which they were planted for the seeds, they're going to be classified as Zeraim, and one may not put them into a garden patch together with the other species. But if they were planted for the greens, they're going to be classified as Yerushalmi. One can put them into a garden patch together with the other species. And lastly, says this Gemara, concerning all other garden seeds that are not eaten, even though they were planted for the seeds, one may nonetheless put them into a garden patch together with other species. So, in other words, these plants, says the Chazan Ish, are going to still retain the classification of Yerushalmi, no matter whether you're going to be using them for seed or you're going to be using them for the greens. Why? Because, says the Chazan Ish, it is unusual for them to be planted as seeds, and thus when you're walking by and you're looking at it, you're going to assume that it's going to be your coat and not for the seeds. So in other words, it's not really normal that somebody's going to grow lettuce and just grow it, wait till it grows till flowers and make seeds so that you can get the seeds so you can grow more lettuce. Really what's sort of more usual is that you're growing a head of lettuce because you want salad. So the Mishnah now is going to be stated concerning a patch surrounded by a border, and then some erosion happens, and now this patch reduces either in width or in height. And so now if you had something planted on the other side of the border, you don't have this separation you once had. Qualification comes like this. Gemara says, Rabbi Imi says That which you say in the Mishnah concerning a border that became reduced in height refers only to seeds that were already planted in the patch before the erosion of the border. And it says, but to plant in it initially, in other words, to plant new seeds after the border has become reduced in height, that's going to be forbidden. Gemara continues, says, if, however, one transgressed and planted new seeds after the erosion of the border, at a time when the plants were, planted in an allowed way, that's going to be an issue. So Gemara continues, says, since those that had been planted permissibly are permitted to remain in the patch, also those that are planted in violation of the law are going to be allowed to stay there. Rabbi Kanievsky says about this that in any case, the patch contains plants that are at this point too numerous for a patch of this size, but are permitted to remain since they were planted permissibly. Even the new plants planted in violation of law are going to be allowed to remain. Now, the Gemara is going to inquire how far this permit extends. This is definitely a big leniency. You're not allowed to plant these extra plants after the erosion, but if it was done, they're saying nonetheless it's allowed to stay. How far does this leniency go? And the Gemara is going to ask about this, and then it's going to answer it later. Rabbi Yerushalmi asked and said, it is clearly understandable that the second plants that were planted after the erosion of the border were subsequently uprooted from the patch. And then, if that were the case, then the first plants that were planted in an allowed way are still going to be allowed, are still permitted. In other words, they don't need to be uprooted. But if the first plants were uprooted after the second ones were planted, what's the law concerning the second plants? In other words, what happens if you're uprooting one of the plants that's allowed? In other words, I have species A. Species A was allowed. The border was there. I planted species A. And then the border eroded. Now I planted species B. Well, if I uprooted species A, now do I have to uproot species B? So normally if you have something without the border and you plant in the incorrect way, species A, and then you go ahead and you plant species B next to it, you need to uproot species B. But what would happen in this case where you're uprooting species A so that, the permitted one is no longer there? Do you have to get rid of the unpermitted one? Now, we just covered this with Rabbi Kanievsky explaining it, being that, hey, if you had this permitted border and a halachic border, and it's going to be this one tefach patch that erodes, and on one side you plant species A, you're allowed to do that. Then after the erosion, you get planted, you plant B. They're saying that you can leave B, but you're not allowed to plant it. But if you did it, you did it. Fine. The question is, if I got rid of one of the species, do I have to get rid of the unpermitted species now? Gemara is going to answer this. It says that we may derive the answer from this ruling in a Mishnah, which states, this Mishnah, by the way, is going to be in Kilayim 19:6, and it says concerning a tamei bed that has two of its long boards removed to be replaced with two new ones, and indeed one made with new ones, and did not change the holes in which the boards are fitted, but rather fashion new boards so that they fit into the same holes as the original board. Laws as follows. Now, why are we talking about the boards? Well, you had something that was permitted and something changed. So now what happens when you get rid of the thing that was originally permitted and you have the thing that wasn't allowed? So it says in this Gemara explanation of this Mishnah, what it's saying, it says that if the new boards were there subsequently broken, and the bed is going to still be tamei, but if the old boards were subsequently broken, the bed is tahor, even though the new boards are already attached to the bed. This is because everything follows the status of the old board. And Gemara answers and says that this Mishnah is telling us the status of the garden patch where the border eroded is going to be dependent on the plants that were there at the time that it erodes. And therefore, if the second plants get uprooted, the first plants are still permitted. They were always permitted. The Gemara says, but the first plants, if they get uprooted after the second one was planted, the second one is now going to be forbidden to be maintained there. And so Rabbi Kanievsky explains about this, that just as concerning the laws of Tuma, the status of the bed is dependent on the boards that were there when they were rendered tamei, and the boards attached later don't play any role in the tuma status of the bed. And here too, the allowance to maintain the plants in the patch is dependent on the plants that were there at the time the border eroded. And therefore, the ones that are planted later don't play any determination in allowing this role. And therefore, as long as the first plants are there, the other plants can be maintained. But as soon as you take away the allowed plants, the other plants have to be uprooted. That, by the way, is going to be the normal law for Kilayim, so that if you have this other one that is planted in a non-permitted way, and you see that there's not even a border at all, you have to uproot it. Over here, it was allowed on the first one. Second one was planted in an incorrect way, but is still allowed to stay. And this is going to be based on the same logical principle as the border with the beds and trying to have the beds. So the Gemara now is going to get to another discussion. And Rabbi Yonah, and this is going to get into fences. Rabbi Yonah said that Rabbi Zeraim and Rabbi Imi both presented a distinction between a fence and a border in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. One said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that one may place alongside a fence different kinds of seeds, but one may not place alongside a border different kind of seeds, different species of seeds. And the other one said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that a border that was reduced to less than a tefach high is still valid, but a fence that was initially 10 tefachim high and then gets knocked down and reduced in height, it's going to be invalid to serve as a separation between different species of seeds planted on either side of it. Now, the Gemara says that we do not know from Rabbi Yonah who said this distinction in the name of Rabbi Yochanan and who said that in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. However, says this Gemara, from what Rabbi Yossi says, this is going to be Rabbi Yossi the Amara, that it was Rabbi Zera who said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that one may not plant alongside a fence different species of seeds, but one may place alongside a fence different species of seeds, but one may not place alongside a border different species of seeds. And you can conclude, says this Gemara, that Rabbi Imi was the one who said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that a border that was reduced to less than 1 tefach high is still valid, but a 10 tefach high fence that's reduced in height is going to be invalid. In other words, you can't use it anymore to serve as a separation between different kinds of seeds that are planted on either side of it. Now, Mara Fulda says about this that one might have thought that just like a border, it's going to be enough that if it had the required height at one point, and the fence gets knocked down in height a little bit, you should say, well, it should be the same. And Rabbi Yochanan is basically teaching us that's not the case. In other words, initially meeting this height requirement is not enough, just like it would be considering the border. And the idea of a fence is going to be where it's not really going to be the same like a fence. And so that regarding the border, even after the erosion that we had, the required distance can still be there to separate the species. And over here, where you had a height, and the fence is going to no longer be having this height, then it's not going to count as a separation. And concerning the case of the border, the Pnei Moshe says that the species is still separated by this required distance, and so that's why it can stay in place even after the erosion of the border. In other words, if you had a fence and the fence was only half a tefach wide and it's 10 tefachim high, it's a fence. It creates it's fine for creating a separator. And you can have wood fences that are half a tefach wide, no problem. But the problem is now if it comes down to under 10 tefachim, now it doesn't count as a border. And so if you have something planted alongside this fence and something alongside that fence, you don't have enough separation between the two. That's the problem. That's what the Pnei Moshe is pointing out. Rabbi Yossi is going to say like this in the Gemara. It says that we have also learned both of these rulings in the Mishnah. In other words, the distinction between a border that was reduced in height and a fence that was reduced in height. And the implication is it can be inferred from the Mishnah, which states that a border that was reduced in height to less than a tefach is still valid. That's going to be from the Mishnah that teaches that concerning a border and not a fence, it can be inferred that this is going to apply to a border. But a 10 tefach high fence that was reduced and height is invalid to serve as a separation to separate between different species. So, if you have it where you're planting alongside of the fence, in other words, there's no setback, which you're allowed to do if it's 10 tefachim high, but now if it's not 10 tefachim high, it's not a border. In the case of the eroded border, and you did have a separation of at least 1 tefach distance between this and that. Now, if part of it erodes, that 1 tefach separation is still going to be there. That's going to be the distinction. Now, support for the second distinction is going to be like this, and then we're going to be finishing up. And it says that the fact that one may place different species of seeds alongside a wall, that's explicit in the Mishnah. In other words, there's no setback from a wall, you're allowed to do it, as long as it's 10 tefachim high. For we learned in the Mishnah that one may plant different species next to, on either side of an uncultivated area of land, or plowed land, or an unmortared stone wall, or road, or a fence that's 10 tefachim high. That Mishnah that we covered earlier in the second Kilayim is basically stating that one of these items can serve as a separator, and what would that be? A 10 tefachim high fence. Now, concerning a border, we can infer from the Mishnah that one may not place different species of seeds alongside a border, because we learned in our Mishnah with regards to the furrow and the channel, that's going to be this Mishnah, whose whose tefach high wall can be compared to a tefach high wall of a border. And concerning a furrow and a water channel that are going to be 1 tefach deep, we can plant on either side and one in the middle 3 varieties of seeds classified as Yerushalmi. Certainly melons would not count. Certainly giant leafy vegetables like turnips wouldn't count. And certainly grain wouldn't count for that. But for Yerushalmi, that would be okay. And basically the Gemara says 1 on either side and 1 in the middle. And the Gemara says that if you will say that one may indeed place different species of seeds alongside a border, then why does the Mishnah permit planting only 1 species in the actual furrow or channel itself? And the Gemara is going to basically be answering and saying one should be permitted to plant several rows of seeds in the furrow or channel. So Gemara is going to challenge this about, because we had before, okay, you can't do 5 species around this hole. You can do 3. And it's basically saying, well, inside of the furrow, inside of this water channel or this pit, why can't you do more than 1? So the Gemara is going to challenge it. And the scholars said before, Rabbi Shmuel bar Avin, perhaps, in fact, a border can serve as a separator. As far as our Mishnah is interpreting it, it can be a case where one planted some seeds of 2 different species on the very top of the border, and one would be on the edge of the border. And in this case, only 1 species should be allowed inside of the channel. That's going to basically be where you're saying, okay, this is going to be like, it's at least in this pit, and the pit is at least 1 tefach deep, and that's not going to be any different than if you're planting it in a bordered area where the border is at least a tefach high. In both cases, they're a tefach high. This challenge gets refuted. Rabbi Shmuel bar Avin says back to them that if this is so, that it would say that then he should uproot the stalk that's planted on the edge and make sure that there's a setback basically, and then he should just plant several rows of seeds below inside of the water channel. And basically he's saying that in this Gemara that is it not better to uproot a single stalk at the edge of the wall? And the Gemara says, but allow him to plant several rows inside of this channel. And in other words, really what this is trying to play with is that, without the, stalks on the edge of this in, the top part of, before it gets into the pit area, basically what it's saying is, isn't this just going to be a border like the walkway? And, shouldn't I be able to say that this is now like a border and, this is going to be like a case like, hey, I have a patch here, and inside of here, why can't I just plant it like a 6x6 tefach patch that's separated by a border, or say that in fact there's not even a border here, that it's like a 6x6 patch without a border. That's really what it's asking. And the Gemara is going to sum this up, and it's going to say, concerning a furrow and a water channel that are 1 tefach deep, that one may plant in either side 3 varieties of seeds, 1 on one side, 1 on the other side, and 1 in the middle. The Gemara is going to provide a dissenting opinion. Bar Koppur says in the Gemara that in this brisa, one may plant in either the furrow or the water channel only one kind of seed. So no, you can't go do rows. And really what Bar Koppur is saying is he's saying that only one species can be planted, and that's going to be inside of the furrow itself. And you can't plant, say, two species in there. And Bar Koppur is basically reasoning that if the outside edges are going to be planted and the plants inside the furrow are going to appear to be closed in by the species that's going to be at ground level on the edges. And we already learned that you're not allowed to close in the other species. However, this is following the approach that is saying that the Mishnah means, as the Rosh is going to be explaining, that Bar Koppur is arguing that just as different species can't be planted in an area surrounded by a fence, they also can't be planted together in an area surrounded by this vertical wall of the furrow. In other words, that you can't just pretend like, oh, this is going to be like the last Mishnah where you have a blank area and you can start planting, or you could say, oh, this is going to be like the bordered area and you can start planting. Really, what this is going to be saying is this is very much a case where it's like an area that you surrounded with a fence. And with this pit or this water channel, it's like an area surrounded with a fence. And when you do that, inside of the fence, you can only plant one species. And basically we had an example like, oh, there's a valley somewhere in Israel. This was early in Kilayim, and only one species is allowed to be planted there. Why? Because the walls of this valley are so steep that it counts as a fence. And within the area of a fence, only one species. And because you have this channel that's in there, you can't plant rows of it. It's going to be like a fence, a little area like a fence, and only one can be there, not multiple. So basically, they were asking, why can't you do multiple ones? Why can't you do multiple species inside where you're just taking off the outer rows next to, before it gets into this pit? And it's saying that why can't you create these setbacks and then start creating a system where you can start doing more than one species inside? And Bar Koppur is coming back and saying no, because it's in a pit and it's raised, it's going to be counted like it's going to be within a fenced-in area, and the law is within a fenced-in area, only one species can be planted there. Have a great day.